There's a stretch of Route 17 just outside Ashford, Maine, that people like to talk about in whispers. A road with cracked asphalt and leaning telephone poles that seem like they've given up on standing straight. Truckers call it Dead Man's Alley, and locals, those who've lived there long enough to know, don't drive it after dark unless they have to. Not after what happened to the Samuels family. I heard this story from Big Lou, the bartender at the Hollow Inn, where I stop for a beer whenever I visit Ashford. He told me it happened about 12 years ago, though he spoke like it was yesterday. It starts with the kids, Lou said, wiping a glass like bartenders in bad movies. His voice was low, like the words themselves might call something up if he said them too loud. Always does, doesn't it? Little ones see things before the rest of us do. They know when something ain't right. According to Lou, the Samuels were your regular middle-class family. Carl Samuels worked construction, built those ugly beige houses for suburbanites. His wife, Jenny, sold real estate. They had a boy, Joey, who was 8, and a daughter, Kaylee, who was 4. One night, on their way home from a wedding, they decided to take Route 17 because the interstate was backed up. It was past midnight, and Carl was eager to get the kids in bed. Joey had fallen asleep in the back seat, but Kaylee was wide awake, chattering about the moon. "Daddy," she said, "do you see the man?" Carl glanced in the rearview mirror. Kaylee was staring out the side window, her little face pale in the moonlight. "There's no man, honey," he said, his voice tired. "Yes, there is," she pointed. "He's running." Jenny turned in her seat, frowning. "Who's running, sweetie?" "The man with no face." Carl felt a chill, the kind that creeps up your spine even when the heater's blasting. He glanced at Jenny, who gave him a shrug like she's just tired. Carl let it go. But Kaylee kept pointing, her tiny hand trembling. "He's keeping up with us," she whispered. Carl pressed the gas. Lou paused here, leaning forward like he was about to tell me a punchline. Only it wasn't funny. They found their car 2 days later, halfway submerged in the Washburn swamp. No skid marks, no sign they even tried to brake. Just gone off the road. Kaylee and Joey were in the back seat. Both drowned. I stared at Lou, the beer in my hand forgotten. "What about Carl and Jenny?" He shrugged. "Never found them. No bodies, no nothing. State police wrote it up as driver fatigue. Happens all the time, right? Folks nod off, drift into the swamp. Case closed." I wanted to believe him. Really, I did. But Lou wasn't done. "Thing is," he said, leaning in even closer, that stretch of road. "People keep seeing them. The kids. There have been at least 6 reports in the last decade. Always the same. A little girl waving by the roadside. A boy asleep in the back of a phantom car. But it's the man who scares them off. The one Kaylee talked about. The man with no face," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Lou nodded. "They say he's still running, right alongside them. Sometimes you'll catch him in the corner of your eye, matching speed with your car. But if you look too long, he climbs in." The house on Fuller's Hill had been empty for as long as anyone could remember. Not boarded up, just abandoned, like its previous occupants had left in a hurry. It was one of those squat, ugly places from the 1920s, with flaking yellow paint and windows that reflected light like dead fish eyes. Kids dared each other to throw rocks at it, but they didn't linger. Dogs wouldn't go near the place. Birds either. Nobody talked much about what happened there, but everyone knew. "It's not haunted," my Uncle Jeff had said once, half drunk on Miller Lite and fishing for an argument. "Place is just cursed." There's a difference. It wasn't until I was 16 that I found out what he meant. That summer, I worked at a gas station just down the hill, a nothing job that paid for my car insurance and kept my mom off my back. Nights were dead slow, just me and the buzzing fluorescents, killing time with a paperback or flipping through smutty magazines I pretended not to care about. One Friday night, around 11, this guy comes in. Big dude, maybe 6'4", wearing a camo jacket and boots caked in mud. Looked like the kind of guy who spent his weekends wrestling bears for fun. "Evanen," I said, forcing a smile. He grunted, grabbed a six-pack, and threw a $10 bill on the counter. Didn't wait for change. But as he turned to leave, he stopped. "You work here all night?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Till 2, I said. He nodded, like that was the answer he expected. Then he glanced out the window, up toward the hill. "You ever hear it?" I frowned. "Hear what?" He didn't answer right away. Just shifted his weight, staring up the hill like it might start talking back. Finally, he said, "The laughing." I felt a cold weight settle in my gut. "Sometimes," he went on, "it sounds like kids. Sometimes it doesn't, but you'll hear it. If you're close enough." He left after that, boots crunching on the gravel lot. I watched his truck disappear down the road, and I thought, what the hell was that about? I found out 2 hours later. It started as a faint hum, like wind through the trees. Only there wasn't any wind. The night was still as a photograph, the air heavy with that sticky kind of summer heat. Then came the giggling. It sounded like a child at first. A little girl, maybe 8 or 9, laughing the way kids do when they've just pulled off some prank. It drifted down the hill, faint but clear, like it was meant just for me. "Hello," I called, stepping outside. The sound stopped. I stood there for a long minute, staring up toward Fuller's Hill. Nothing moved. No cars. No crickets. Just dead silence. Then I heard it again, louder this time. Only it wasn't a giggle anymore. It was a cackle, deep and wet, like something laughing through a mouthful of water. My heart jumped into my throat, and I stumbled back inside, slamming the door and locking it. The sound grew louder, closer, filling the air like smoke. It wasn't just one voice now, it was a dozen, maybe more. Some high, some low, all of them laughing together in this awful, choking harmony. And then it stopped. I waited, frozen, for what felt like hours but was probably just a few seconds. My breathing was loud in the silence, ragged and shallow. Then the door rattled. Not a knock, not a bump. It rattled hard, like something was yanking on the handle. I didn't stick around to see what it was. I grabbed my keys, bolted for my car, and didn't stop driving until I was halfway to Bangor. I quit the job the next day. When I told my Uncle Jeff about it, his face went pale. He didn't laugh it off or call me crazy. Instead, he said, "That's why nobody stays up there. House doesn't want anyone. Never has." I asked him what happened to the people who lived there before. "They didn't leave," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not really. You hear them every time it gets quiet enough. They say you can still hear the screams on the old train tracks outside of Darby, New Hampshire. You know the kind of place I'm talking about, one of those nowhere towns with a gas station, a diner that closes at p.m., and a post office that smells like mildew. People live there because their families have always lived there. No one moves in. No one moves out. The tracks aren't used anymore, of course. Haven't been for decades. Not since the big derailment in '72. But they're still there, running like a jagged scar through the woods on the east side of town. And every few years, someone sees him. I first heard the story when I was 13. It was Halloween, and a bunch of us had crammed into Mike Kavanagh's basement to watch The Exorcist on his dad's VCR. Somewhere between the pea soup and the spinning head, Tommy Winslow started talking about the man in the tracks. "You're not supposed to look him in the eyes," Tommy said, his face lit all spooky by the glow of the TV. "Why not?" I asked, because I was 13 and stupid. Tommy grinned. "Because he'll follow you. He'll wait until you're alone, and then he'll bullshit." Mike cut in, throwing a handful of popcorn at Tommy. "That's just a dumb story to scare kids. Ask my cousin Eddie," Tommy shot back. "He saw him. Said he was wearing one of those old conductor's hats, and his face was wrong." "What do you mean, wrong?" Tommy shrugged. "Like it didn't fit together right. Like his mouth was too big, and his eyes were too far apart. Eddie only looked for a second, but that was enough. He said the guy just stood there, staring at him, and then he smiled. And I swear to God, that smile." Tommy trailed off, leaving the rest to our imaginations. 2 weeks later, Eddie Winslow disappeared. I didn't think much about the man in the tracks after that. Life moved on, as it tends to do, and by the time I was in my 20s, the story was just another piece of local folklore. Something to laugh about over beers when you wanted to creep someone out. But then, a few months ago, I saw him. It was late just after midnight, and I was driving home from a bartending shift at Darby's one and only nightlife hotspot, which is just a fancy way of saying a dive bar with sticky floors and a jukebox that only works half the time. The main road was closed for construction, so I had to take the back way, the one that crosses the old tracks. I hadn't thought about Eddie in years. The night was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes your joints ache. My headlights cut through the dark, illuminating nothing but trees and the cracked asphalt ahead. And then I saw him. He was standing on the tracks, right in the middle of the crossing. Tall and thin, with a tattered coat and a brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. For a second, I thought it was just some drunk who'd wandered too far from town. But then he turned his head. His eyes caught the light, glowing pale and flat, like the eyes of a dead fish. And his smile. Jesus Christ, that smile. It stretched too wide, the corners of his mouth pulling back until they disappeared into the darkness. I slammed on the brakes, my heart jackhammering in my chest. The car skidded to a stop just a few feet from the tracks, but when I looked again, he was gone. I sat there for what felt like hours, my hands shaking on the wheel. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light. Too many beers after my shift. But when I finally worked up the nerve to drive across the tracks, I heard it, the whistle, low and mournful, like a train pulling into the station. Only there hadn't been a train on those tracks in 50 years. I didn't tell anyone about what I saw, not at first. Who'd believe me? I didn't even believe me. But then I started seeing him. At first, it was just flashes. A tall figure in the corner of my eye, gone when I turned to look. A shadow in my rearview mirror that shouldn't have been there. But it got worse. Last week, I woke up to find muddy footprints leading from my front door to my bedroom. They stopped right at the foot of my bed. And last night, I heard the whistle again. It's not a story anymore. It's real. And if you see him, if you see the man in the tracks, don't look. Because once you do, he'll never stop looking back. There's a stretch of Route 6 in Maine where nobody stops. Not unless they're desperate, or stupid, or both. It's called Black Hollow Road, but locals just call it the Whispering Woods. I was a kid the first time I heard about it. My dad was driving us home from one of his work sites He was a carpenter back then, before his knees gave out, and he pointed to the thick line of trees on the edge of the highway. "See that?" he said. "That's where they found the Sullivan boys. What was left of them, anyway." I turned to look, expecting to see something gruesome, but all I saw were trees. Hundreds of them, stretching endlessly into the gray autumn sky. "What happened to them?" I asked. Dad tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "They went into the woods. Never came back. Not in one piece anyway." I didn't ask any more questions after that. The story goes like this. If you break down on Black Hollow Road, you're supposed to stay in your car. No matter what you hear, no matter what you think you see, you don't get out. Not for the whispers. Not for the shadows. And especially not for the children. That's the part that always got me, the children. They'll call to you, people say. Voices soft as feathers, begging for help. But if you follow them into the woods, nobody finishes that sentence. It wasn't until years later that I found out why. I was 22, just out of college, and still dumb enough to think the world made sense. I'd gotten a job as a field surveyor for a land development company. Mostly, it was boring stuff, measuring plots of land, taking soil samples, pretending I gave a damn about zoning laws. That's how I ended up on Black Hollow Road. It was late, probably past midnight, and I was driving back to my motel after a long day of checking property lines. The woods loomed on either side of the road, blacker than the sky above. My headlights barely seemed to dent the darkness. And then my engine sputtered. "Shit," I muttered, pulling over to the side of the road. I popped the hood and grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment. The air was cold and heavy, carrying the faint smell of damp leaves and something else, something metallic. I told myself it was just the engine overheating. But as I stepped out of the car, I heard it. A whisper. "Help me." It was faint, almost drowned out by the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I froze. Hello, nothing. Just the wind. I should have gotten back in the car right then. I should have locked the doors, waited for a tow truck, and chalked it all up to nerves. But instead, I did the dumbest thing I've ever done in my life. I followed the voice. The trees swallowed me whole. The further I walked, the quieter the world became. No wind. No rustling leaves. Just my own footsteps crunching on the forest floor, and the soft, pitiful voice that led me deeper and deeper into the woods. "Help me." It sounded like a child, a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old. I couldn't see her, but every time I stopped, the voice would call out again, closer this time. "Please, I'm lost." My flashlight flickered, then went out completely. "Damn it," I whispered, smacking it against my palm. When the light came back on, she was there. A girl standing just a few feet away, barefoot and pale as the moonlight. Her hair hung in wet, tangled strands over her face, and her dress was torn and stained with something dark. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice shaking. She didn't answer. She just lifted her head, and that's when I saw her eyes. Or rather, the empty sockets where her eyes should have been. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. It hit the ground with a dull thud, and for a moment, everything was pitch black. When I scrambled to pick it up, she was gone. But the whispers weren't. They were all around me now, overlapping and echoing like a broken record. "Help me. Don't leave. Stay with us." I ran. Branches clawed at my face and arms as I tore through the woods, following some primal instinct to get the hell out of there. The whispers grew louder, angrier, until they were more like screams. "Don't go. Stay." I burst out of the trees and onto the road, gasping for air. My car was still there, its headlights cutting through the dark, But the whispers didn't stop. Not until I was inside with the doors locked and the engine roaring to life. I never told anyone what happened that night, but sometimes when I'm lying in bed with the lights off, I can still hear them. The whispers. And when I close my eyes, I see her face. I haven't driven down Black Hollow Road since. And if you're smart, you won't either. It started with the creaking. At first, it was the kind of noise any old house might make, wood shifting as it settles, faint groans as the temperature drops. Nothing unusual, really. My wife, Dana, said it was just the house breathing. She always had a way of making things sound poetic. "It's just the old girl talking to us," she'd say, running a hand over the polished wood of the banister. We'd moved into the place only 3 months before. A big colonial house in Durham, Maine, built sometime in the early 1900s. It was the kind of house that felt heavy with history-faded wallpaper, warped floorboards, a basement that smelled like damp earth and forgotten time. It needed work, but we weren't afraid of a project. Until the noises started to change. The creaks became thumps. Not loud, but steady, like someone walking barefoot on the hardwood at night. At first, I thought it was Dana getting up for a glass of water or to check on the dog. But every time I turned over to look, she was there, sound asleep beside me. One night, I got up to investigate. The thumps were coming from the living room. The dog, Tucker, was sitting in the hallway, his ears flat against his head, eyes locked on the darkened doorway. When I tried to coax him to follow me, he wouldn't budge. "Coward," I muttered, stepping into the living room. The air felt colder, heavier somehow. The thumps stopped as soon as I switched on the light. Hello, nothing. Just the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I checked every corner of the room, even peeking behind the couch and under the coffee table. Nothing. Just shadows. A few days later, Dana heard it too. It was just past midnight when she shook me awake, her face pale in the dim light. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" She grabbed my arm. "Shh. Listen." I held my breath, straining to catch whatever she was hearing. And then I did. A soft, rhythmic scratching. It wasn't coming from the walls or the ceiling, it was beneath us. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. Dana didn't answer. She just stared at me, wide-eyed, as the sound grew louder, more frantic, like nails raking against wood. The basement. I hated that damn basement. The ceilings were low, the walls were made of rough stone, and the single bulb hanging from the ceiling cast more shadows than light. I brought a flashlight with me, just in case, and stepped carefully down the creaky wooden stairs. "Hello?" I called out, feeling ridiculous. The scratching stopped. I shone the flashlight around the room, the beam cutting through the damp air. Old furniture, boxes of junk left by the previous owners, cobwebs that swayed gently in some invisible breeze. Nothing unusual. And then I saw it. A patch of dirt in the far corner, just beneath the old coal chute. It looked disturbed. I walked over, my footsteps muffled by the dirt floor. The closer I got, the worse the air smelled, like mildew and rot, and something faintly metallic. I crouched down, brushing away the loose soil with my hand. That's when I found the fingernail. We called the cops. They dug up the basement the next day, uncovering a shallow grave with the remains of a young woman inside. She'd been there a long time, maybe 20, 30 years, the coroner said. Her name was Margaret Fields. She'd gone missing in 1987, back when the house had belonged to a man named Arthur Graves. The cops told us Graves had died in prison in the early 90s, something about tax fraud. They didn't think he was the kind of guy who'd kill someone, but they couldn't exactly ask him about it now. Dana and I tried to put it behind us, but the house didn't let us. The noises didn't stop. In fact, they got worse. The thumping came back, louder this time, and the scratching turned into pounding. Tucker refused to go near the basement, and Dana started sleeping with the lights on. One night, I woke up to find her standing at the bedroom window, staring out into the yard. "What are you doing?" I asked groggily. She didn't answer. I got up and walked over to her, gently touching her shoulder. That's when she turned to me, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. "She's outside," Dana whispered. "She's watching us." I didn't see anyone when I looked. Just the empty yard bathed in pale moonlight. But Dana was convinced. "It's her," she said. "Margaret. She doesn't want us here." I tried to reassure her, but deep down, I felt it too, that cold, creeping dread that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. That night, I dreamed about the basement, about the patch of dirt where Margaret's body had been buried. Except in the dream, the grave wasn't empty. Something was moving beneath the soil, trying to claw its way out. We left the house a month later, sold it to a young couple from Boston who didn't seem to care about the history. I didn't tell them about the noises or the grave, or the way Tucker used to bark at empty corners. I figured they'd find out soon enough. And as we drove away for the last time, I swear I saw her, standing in the upstairs window, watching us leave, smiling. Route 9 is the kind of road you don't drive unless you have to. A forgotten stretch of asphalt that connects two nowhere towns in northern Maine. It's quiet, dark, and endless. The kind of place where the headlights only catch trees and your own creeping paranoia. I was heading home from work, cutting through the back roads to save time. It was late, close to midnight, and the sky hung heavy with low clouds. No moon, no stars, just that oppressive black silence that seems to absorb everything. The radio didn't work out there. All I had was the rhythmic thump of my tires against the pavement. And then, just past mile marker 62, I saw the girl. She was standing on the shoulder, right at the edge of the woods. Young, maybe 13 or 14, with long, dark hair and a pale, almost translucent face. She wore a tattered white dress that looked like it belonged in another century. I hit the brakes, the car skidding slightly on the damp road. "What the hell?" I muttered, my heart pounding. She didn't move, just stood there, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. I rolled down the window, leaning out into the chilly night air. "Hey, are you okay?" No answer. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wet leaves and something else, something faintly metallic, like blood. I should have driven away. God knows I wanted to, but there was something about her, something wrong. And if there's one thing my mom drilled into me growing up, it's that you don't leave people stranded on the side of the road. I pulled over and got out, my boots crunching against the gravel shoulder. "Do you need help?" I asked, my voice shaky. She tilted her head slightly, like a dog trying to understand a command. That's when I noticed her hands. They were covered in something dark and wet, dripping onto the ground. What the loud snap echoed from the woods behind her. I froze, my eyes darting toward the tree line. The girl didn't react. "Who's out there?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. Nothing. Just the rustle of leaves in the cold breeze. When I turned back to the girl, she was gone. I got back in the car, slamming the door and locking it for good measure. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, my breath fogging up the windshield. "Just go," I whispered to myself. "Just drive." But as I reached for the ignition, I saw her again. She was standing in the middle of the road, directly in front of my car. Her dress was soaked with what I could only assume was blood, her dark hair plastered to her face. "Jesus Christ," I muttered, my heart hammering in my chest. I honked the horn, hoping she'd move. She didn't. Instead, she raised one bloodied hand and pointed to the woods. I don't know why I got out of the car again. Maybe it was morbid curiosity. Maybe it was fear. Or maybe it was something else, something I still can't explain. But I did. I stepped out into the cold night, my breath visible in the dim glow of the headlights. She was gone again, but her footprints remained. Small, bare prints, smeared with blood, leading into the forest. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. "Are you there?" No response. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn around. But something about those footprints drew me in, like they were pulling me forward. The trees closed in around me as I stepped off the road, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. The air smelled of damp earth and decay. And then I saw it. A cabin. It was small and decrepit, leaning to one side, like it had given up the fight against time. The windows were boarded up, but faint light seeped through the cracks. The footprints led straight to the door. "Kid," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The door creaked open, and for a moment, I thought I saw her standing inside, her silhouette framed by the faint flickering light. "Are you okay?" I asked, stepping closer. She didn't move. I reached the doorway, my heart pounding in my ears. The smell hit me first, an overwhelming stench of rot and copper. I gagged, covering my nose with my sleeve. And then I saw them. Bodies. They were everywhere on the floor, slumped against the walls, hanging from the rafters like grotesque decorations. Men, women, children. Their faces were twisted in expressions of agony, their bodies covered in deep, jagged wounds. In the center of the room stood the girl. She was holding a knife long and rusted, its blade slick with blood. She turned to me, her dark eyes gleaming in the dim light. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice soft and distant, like it was coming from somewhere far away. My legs felt like they were made of lead. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And then she smiled. I don't remember running back to the car. I don't remember starting the engine or slamming my foot on the gas. All I know is that when I looked in the rearview mirror, she was sitting in the back seat. Her eyes met mine, and she whispered, "You'll never leave. I don't drive Route 9 anymore. Hell, I don't drive at night, period. And when the wind blows just right, I swear I can still hear her voice soft and distant, calling me back to that cabin in the woods. I won't go back. Not ever." When I was 13, my dad used to say, "Never walk alone at night, Joey. Bad things happen in the dark." I thought he was just being overprotective. After all, we lived in Whitefield, Massachusetts, a small town where the biggest crime was someone shoplifting a pack of gum at Charlie's Market. But that summer, I found out he wasn't warning me about criminals. He was warning me about something much worse. It was July 8th, 1997. I remember the date because it was the night our town's annual carnival set up at Fairgrounds Park. I was there with my best friend, Kenny, a gangly kid with a mop of red hair and a laugh that sounded like a wheezy accordion. The carnival was the highlight of our summer. Cheap rides, rigged games, and greasy food that left your stomach churning. We loved every second of it. That night, we stayed until the lights dimmed and the music died. By the time we left, it was past midnight and the streets were eerily quiet. Kenny lived 2 blocks away, so we walked together to his place first. After we said our goodbyes, I headed home alone, cutting through the wooded path that connected Fairgrounds Park to my neighborhood. It was a shortcut I'd taken 100 times before. But that night, it felt different. The first thing I noticed was the silence. No crickets, no rustling leaves, not even the distant hum of the carnival's generators. Just the sound of my sneakers crunching against the gravel path. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe the carnival had been so loud it left everything else feeling muted. But then I saw him. He was standing about 20 feet ahead of me, just off the path, where the trees cast long shadows. A tall man, dressed in a suit that seemed too clean, too perfect for someone out here in the middle of the woods. His back was turned to me, but I could tell he was tall at least 6.5 feet. Hello, I called out, my voice cracking slightly. The man didn't move. I stopped walking. Every instinct in my body screamed for me to turn around, to run back the way I came. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, staring at his motionless figure, my heart hammering in my chest. And then he turned. His face. God, I'll never forget his face. He was smiling, but it wasn't a normal smile. His lips were stretched impossibly wide, curling up at the edges like they were being pulled by invisible hooks. His teeth were perfect, white and straight, but there were too many of them. Lovely night for a walk, isn't it? He said, his voice smooth and deep, like a radio announcer's. I couldn't respond. My mouth had gone dry, and my legs felt rooted to the spot. He took a step toward me, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel. "Where are you going, Joey?" he asked. I never told him my name. I turned and ran, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The path seemed endless, the trees closing in around me as I sprinted toward the faint glow of the streetlights ahead. Behind me, I heard footsteps slow, deliberate, unhurried. "Why are you running?" He called out, his voice closer than it should have been. We were having such a nice conversation, I didn't dare look back. When I finally burst out of the woods and onto the street, I risked a glance over my shoulder. He was gone. By the time I got home, I was a mess sweaty, shaking, and on the verge of tears. I tried to tell my parents what happened, but they chalked it up to an overactive imagination and too much carnival junk food. "Go to bed, Joey," my dad said, ruffling my hair. "You'll feel better in the morning." I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that smile. The next morning, Kenny didn't show up for breakfast. By noon, his parents had called the police. They said he'd gone missing sometime after leaving the carnival. They never found him. For years, I tried to convince myself that what I saw that night wasn't real. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But then, last week, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, no postage stamp, just a plain white envelope slid under my door. Inside was a single piece of paper with 2 words scrawled in perfect, looping handwriting, "Still smiling." And now, every night, when I walk past my bedroom window, I see him, standing on the sidewalk, watching, waiting, always smiling. There's a stretch of old railway tracks outside Hollow Creek, New Hampshire. No one talks about it much, but everyone knows about it. The tracks haven't been used in decades, not since the derailment in 1962 that killed 32 people. After that, the town sealed off the old train yard, let the woods take it over. My Uncle Todd told me about it when I was 10, during one of those late summer nights when the air is thick and the crickets never shut up. We were sitting on the porch of his place, sipping Coke from glass bottles, and he just blurted it out like it had been clawing at his throat all evening. They say you can still hear the train sometimes, he said, staring out at the dark trees that surrounded his house. If you're out by the tracks after midnight, you'll hear the whistle. And if you're really unlucky, you might even see it. I laughed it off at the time. Uncle Todd was always full of tall tales, most of them designed to scare the hell out of me. But something about the way he said it stuck with me, the way his voice dropped, the way his eyes darted around, like he expected the train to come barreling down the driveway. It wasn't until years later, when I was 17 and stupid, that I found myself out by those tracks. Me and my friends Danny, Sarah, and Nick had been hanging out at the old quarry, drinking cheap beer and telling ghost stories. Hollow Creek didn't have much in the way of entertainment, so we made do with what we had. Somehow, the conversation turned to the tracks. Danny, ever the skeptic, scoffed at the idea of a ghost train. "Come on," he said, crushing his beer can against a rock. "You guys don't really believe that crap, do you? It's just a stupid town legend," Sarah shrugged. "I've heard people talk about it. My grandma swears she saw it once when she was a kid." Nick, who was already halfway too drunk, grinned. "Only one way to find out, right?" Before I could think better of it, we were piling into Nick's beat-up Chevy and heading for the tracks. The place was even creepier than I expected. The woods pressed in close on either side, the branches curling like skeletal fingers. The air was heavy, almost wet, and it smelled like damp leaves and rust. We parked a few yards from the tracks and got out, flashlights cutting through the gloom. The old rails were warped and overgrown, the metal pitted with rust. "See," Danny said, kicking at one of the TIs. "Nothing here but a bunch of junk," but then we heard it. It started as a low hum, so faint I thought I was imagining it. But it grew louder, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "What the hell is that?" Sarah whispered, clutching my arm. Danny laughed nervously. "Probably just an old generator or something." But his voice wavered, and we all knew better. There was no power out here, no houses for miles. Then came the whistle. It wasn't a normal train whistle. It was high and shrill, like metal scraping against metal, and it cut through the air like a blade. We froze, every instinct screaming at us to run, but our legs refused to move. The light came next to pale, sickly glow that flickered through the trees, casting twisted shadows. It wasn't like the headlight of a real train. It was dim and uneven, like a lantern swinging in the wind. And then we saw it. The train emerged from the darkness, its shape warped and jagged, like something out of a nightmare. The cars were old, their sides scorched and dented, with windows shattered into jagged teeth. But it was the people inside that made my blood turn to ice. They were pressed against the glass, their faces pale and stretched in unnatural ways. Their mouths gaped open in silent screams, and their eyes were black, empty voids that seemed to pull at me, dragging me into their despair. "Run," Nick whispered, his voice barely audible. No one argued. We bolted for the car, tripping over roots and rocks, the sound of the train's wheels grinding against the rails chasing us. I swear it was right behind us, close enough to feel the heat of it, to smell the acrid stench of burning metal. We piled into the Chevy, Nick fumbling with the keys as the rest of us screamed at him to hurry. The engine roared to life, and we tore out of there, the headlights bouncing wildly as we hit every pothole on the dirt road. When we finally reached the highway, Nick slammed on the brakes, and we sat there in stunned silence, gasping for breath. Did you see it?" Sarah finally asked, her voice trembling. None of us answered. We never talked about it again. Not really. Nick moved away a few months later. Danny stopped coming around. Sarah and I drifted apart, the way people do after high school. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the whistle, and I know it's still out there, waiting for the next group of idiots to come looking for it.